Hi Katie.
Hi Jamina.
Well, it's great to be here with you on Mozart Snapshots.
Thanks, it's great to see you too, and to welcome you to the town of Mozart, because you come from the home of another famous classical composer.
That's true. I come from Bonn in Germany. That's the birthplace of Ludwig van Beethoven, and he lived there until he left to Vienna in 1792.
Mozart actually visited Bonn on the 27th till the 28th of September 1763. He didn't perform there, but we do know that he visited the city. I know that you already visited the Mozart Geburtshaus. When I was in Bonn, the first thing I also did was to visit Beethoven's house. But I want to show you something that is a little bit off of the tourist path. This is a place where the Mozart family actually went for walks, and this is called Kapuzinerberg. It is a little bit of alpine beauty in the city, and it also rises to the very highest point in Salzburg.
Well, we always think of Salzburg for its beautiful Baroque architecture, but the natural setting is really beautiful too.
It is, and that's actually why Mozart is quoted as saying that of all the lovely regions I've ever visited, none can compare to Salzburg's natural beauty.
He had a love-hate relationship with his home, I guess.
He definitely did, but I think it was more with the Archbishop than with the city itself, because Mozart always felt really stifled by authority, and so I think the older that he got, the more that he felt that way, and so at a certain point, he decided he had to make a break.
So tell me about these little chapels.
So these are all Station of the Cross monuments depicting the Passion of Christ, and there's actually 11 of them that you will see along this way to the top. And they were built around the year 1736 to 1740, and each one of these is created in wood by local Salzburg artists. And so as you can imagine, Mozart and his family walked past these very little chapels.
Wow, Salzburg is filled with churches and religious monuments.
That's right, because Salzburg was actually an archbishopric dating all the way back to the 1200s. And so the archbishop not only was the head of the church, but also of the state. And so it was actually an extremely religious place. And the Mozart family also was very religious. And what we know from many of their letters, they attended Mass really more or less every day.
It was a somewhat similar situation in Bonn when Beethoven was born. At that time, Bonn was the capital of the Electorate of Cologne and was part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was ruled by the elector or archbishop.
Interestingly enough, the respective archbishops were both significant early patrons of Mozart and Beethoven. In Mozart's case, it was Archbishop Schrattenbach and later Count Hieronymus von Colloredo.
For Beethoven, it was Maximilian Francis.
That's right. He was actually the one who enabled Beethoven's first visit to Vienna in 1787. Beethoven had always wanted to study with Mozart, and although it's possible that the two met, there's no real evidence that the composers met.
That's right. Beethoven's first visit was cut short by the news of the last illness of his mother. She had gotten very ill, and so he had to return to Bonn. Then, by the time he was able to return to Vienna in 1792, Mozart was already dead. So Beethoven ended up studying with Haydn instead of Mozart.
Oh, that's right. Hence the quote from Count Waldstein to Beethoven, that he would receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands.
To get back to Mozart, he had a much better relationship with Schrattenbach than he had with Colloredo.
That's very true, because Archbishop Schrattenbach actually was a very big supporter of Mozart, and he was very generous with Mozart's father for allowing him and financing him to take his son on all of these big tours across Europe. And then, of course, when Colloredo came in, he was known to be a very different character, because in many ways, not just for the arts, he was quite stingy, and his main objective was actually to balance the budget. And so paying musicians that were permanently gone was probably not something that was particularly interesting for him. And he did play along with it for a while and supported the Mozarts, but at a certain point, he really got tired of financing Mozart's trips being gone, as well as Mozart's complaining.
He's the one he gave him a kick in the butt, as the story goes.
Well, if that story is true, which we don't really know, it would have more likely been the secretary of Colloredo, who was a man by the name of Count Arco. However, it could be that Mozart was just exaggerating, and so maybe it didn't really happen.
Well, in many ways, breaking of her from the Archduke and establishing himself as a freelance musician, Mozart paved the way for Beethoven, because he was basically one of the earliest examples of a freelance musician.
Without a doubt, he not only provided the model for Beethoven to become a freelance musician, but he was also the model for Beethoven's entire musical upbringing. Beethoven's father, Johann van Beethoven, was, like Leopold Mozart, a musician and teacher, and he was employed as a singer in the Archbishop's court in Bonn. Mozart by this time was of course known all over Europe, and so when Johann van Beethoven discovered his son's great talent, he used Leopold Mozart as a model for Ludwig's upbringing. And so he homeschooled him, and he set up a regimen of really strict keyboard practice. And even when Beethoven was finally ready to give his first performance for the public, he was nearly 8 years old. But following Mozart's model, Beethoven's father lied and said that the young Ludwig was only 6 years old, because Mozart had, of course, been 6 years old when he played for Empress Maria Theresa for the first time. The difference between the two fathers, however, was that while Leopold Mozart was strict, he was a loving father and a kind teacher to both of his children. But Beethoven's father was an alcoholic, and he was a strict disciplinarian who often beat his son and never praised him. And then, of course, there's also similarities between the two composers as far as compositional techniques, because you only have to look at Beethoven's piano sonatas to see this comparison, because when Mozart composed his A minor sonata and the C minor sonata in Fantasy, as well as his D minor concerto, these pieces were really revolutionary because of the drama and the emotional intensity, and they paved the way for Beethoven's works like the Pathétique and like the Appassionata and the Opus 10 No. 1 sonatas. And then, of course, there's the often overlooked direct connection between the Moonlight Sonata and Mozart's opera Don Giovanni. Because when Beethoven was composing the Moonlight Sonata, he copied out the scene from Mozart's opera in which Don Giovanni kills the Commendatore. And he makes use of the three-note motif in the harmony, as well as the dotted rhythms in the melody, transposes it up to C-sharp minor, and there you have the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. And of course, the connections go on and on. So this is actually the great Crucifixion monument, and this was created in 1780 by the Salzburg artist Franz de Paula Hitzel.
It must have been very difficult for Mozart to come up this steep path with the women wearing this heavy clothes, I imagine.
Well, in those days, the pilgrims would have actually come up here on their knees, but we will walk up on our legs, because I imagine that Mozart and his family probably also came up on their feet and didn't come up on their knees.
How do you know that he and his family like to come up here?
Because Kapuziner Berg is actually mentioned on numerous occasions in the Mozart letters and diaries. And we know that even during that last visit to Salzburg in 1783, the Mozarts came up here, because Maria Anna wrote in her diary that they came here on the 2nd of August, 1783. The reason being is that they had a good friend named Anna Helena Hermes von Fürstenhof, who lived in this villa, which is today called the Stefan Zweig Villa. And she was very good friends with Maria Anna and with Mozart's mother, and Nanel, or Maria Anna, taught both of her daughters piano.
Well, thank you so much for showing me another side of Salzburg. That was really interesting.
You are very welcome. And before we go, I would like to show you one more special little thing. So come with me this way.
Wow, Mozart is really everywhere.
He is, isn't he?